The last photograph ever taken of Michelle Newton shows her laughing. Her head is thrown back, brown hair catching the late afternoon Kentucky sun, and there's a joy in her 17-year-old face that makes your chest ache when you know what came next. That photograph was taken on March 14, 1983, exactly 4 hours and 27 minutes before Michelle Newton vanished from the face of the earth. But here's the thing they don't tell you in the missing person reports, the thing that kept investigators awake at night and made her mother scream into her pillow until her voice gave out. Michelle Newton didn't just disappear. She was erased, systematically, deliberately, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And for 40 years, everyone believed that person had won. Everyone was wrong. Before you scroll away, before you click on something else, I need you to understand something. This story is going to change the way you look at every missing person case you've ever heard about. It's going to make you question everything you think you know about justice, about time, and about whether the truth can stay buried forever. If this story moves you, if it makes you think, I'm asking you right now to share it. Share it because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear Michelle's story. Someone needs to know that giving up is never the answer. Subscribe to this channel because stories like this one, stories that took decades to unravel, they deserve to be told. They deserve witnesses. Now let me take you back to Kentucky, 1983, and show you who Michelle Newton really was. Michelle grew up in a small town outside of Louisville, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business, or at least they thought they did. Her father, Richard Newton, owned a modest auto repair shop on Main Street. Her mother, Dorothy, worked part-time at the elementary school as a secretary. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't struggling either. They existed in that comfortable middle ground of American life where the bills got paid on time, and there was always food on the table and love in the house. Michelle was their only child, born after Dorothy had suffered 3 miscarriages, and they treasured her with the fierce, desperate love of parents who knew exactly how easily they could have lost her before she even arrived. From the moment Michelle could walk, she was curious. Dorothy used to tell people that Michelle came out of the womb asking questions. Why is the sky blue? Where do birds go when it rains? What happens to people when they die? She wasn't satisfied with simple answers. She needed to understand, really understand, the mechanics of the world around her. By the time she was 12, she had read every book in the small-town library at least once. The librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson, started special ordering books just for Michelle, advanced texts on science and history and philosophy that most kids her age wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. But Michelle wasn't just smart. She was what Dorothy called dangerously observant. She noticed things other people missed. The way Mr. Henderson from the hardware store always got nervous when the topic of his military service came up. The way Mrs. Porter's smile never quite reached her eyes when she talked about her husband. The way Coach Williams watched the girls' volleyball team a little too closely during practice. Michelle saw these things and she filed them away in that brilliant mind of hers, not to gossip, not to judge, but simply because she couldn't help it. Her brain was a sponge that absorbed everything around her, especially the things people wanted to keep hidden. By the time she reached her senior year of high school, Michelle had transformed from a gangly, awkward bookworm into someone who commanded attention without trying. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, not in the homecoming queen sort of way, but there was something magnetic about her. Maybe it was the way she looked at you when you talked, like she was really listening, like what you said mattered. Maybe it was her laugh, sudden and genuine and infectious. Maybe it was the way she moved through the world with a confidence that most 17-year-olds hadn't yet discovered. Whatever it was, people were drawn to Michelle Newton, whether they wanted to be or not. She had dreams, big ones. She was going to leave Kentucky, go to college somewhere far away, become a journalist or maybe a detective or maybe both. She wanted to uncover truths, to shine light into dark corners, to give voice to people who had been silenced. She used to stay up late at night, writing in her journal by flashlight so her parents wouldn't see the light under her door and tell her to go to sleep. She wrote about injustices she'd read about mysteries that hadn't been solved, about her own small observations of the imperfect world around her. She was building something in those journal pages, though she didn't know it yet. She was building the very skills that would one day save her life. But Kentucky in 1983 wasn't always kind of girls who asked too many questions. There were people in that small town who liked things the way they were, who didn't appreciate anyone looking too closely at the cracks in the foundation. And Michelle, without even realizing it, had started looking at exactly the wrong crack, pulling at exactly the wrong thread. She didn't know that her curiosity had painted a target on her back. She didn't know that someone was watching her, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She didn't know that the last 4 hours and 27 minutes of her normal life were already ticking away. The day of March 14th started like any other Monday. Michelle woke up at 6:30, ate breakfast with her parents, and drove to school in the used Chevette her father had fixed up for her 16th birthday. She attended her classes, ate lunch with her best friend Sarah, and stayed after school for a meeting of the school newspaper. She was working on an article about budget discrepancies in the local government, a story that everyone told her was boring but that she insisted was important. At 3:45, she left the school building and walked toward the parking lot where her car was waiting. The last person to see her was the school janitor, Harold Webb, who waved at her from across the lot. She waved back. And then, somewhere between that wave and her front door, Michelle Newton stepped off the edge of the known world and into a nightmare that would last for 4 decades. When Michelle didn't come home for dinner, Dorothy wasn't immediately worried. Michelle was 17, responsible, and had earned a certain amount of freedom through years of good choices. She was probably at Sarah's house, or at the library, or maybe she had stopped for a milkshake at the diner downtown. Dorothy set a plate for her in the oven to keep warm and went about her evening, confident that her daughter would walk through the door any minute with an apology and an explanation. But then 7 o'clock came, then 8, then 9. Richard called Sarah's house and learned that Michelle had left school hours ago, heading straight for her car. He called the library, but they closed at 5 and nobody remembered seeing her. He called the diner, the movie theater, the church youth group meeting place. Nothing. Nobody had seen Michelle Newton since 3:45 that afternoon. By 10 o'clock, Dorothy was hysterical, and Richard was on the phone with the police. In 1983, missing person cases weren't handled the way they are today. There were no Amber Alerts, no social media networks to spread the word instantly, no DNA databases to cross-reference. When Richard called the police that night, the officer on duty told him they needed to wait 24 hours before they could officially report Michelle as missing. She was 17, after all, the officer said. Probably off with a boyfriend somewhere, didn't want her parents to know. Richard hung up the phone with shaking hands, turned to his wife, and for the first time in their 20-year marriage, he watched Dorothy Newton collapse completely. The next morning, when Michelle still hadn't appeared, the police finally took the report. Deputy Frank Morrison came to the Newton house with a notepad and a skeptical expression. He asked questions that made Dorothy's blood boil. Did Michelle have a boyfriend? Had she been acting strangely lately? Was there trouble at home? Any reason she might have run away? Dorothy wanted to scream at him that her daughter wasn't that kind of girl, that Michelle was smart and responsible and would never disappear without telling them. But Richard held her back, kept his voice calm, answered the deputy's questions with the desperate hope that cooperation might bring their daughter home faster. They found Michelle's car 2 days later. It was parked behind an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, the doors locked, the keys still in the ignition. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, nothing to indicate what had happened except for one small detail that made the investigators' blood run cold. On the passenger seat, placed carefully in the center as if someone had left it there on purpose, was Michelle's journal. The one she wrote in every night. The one that contained all her secrets, all her observations, all her dangerous questions. And on the last page, in handwriting that wasn't Michelle's, someone had written 8 words. Curious little girls should learn to stay quiet. The investigation that followed was, by all accounts, a disaster. The local police were small-town, understaffed, and completely unprepared for a case like this. They brought in state investigators, who seemed more interested in interviewing Michelle's classmates about potential drug use than in following actual leads. They interviewed Harold Webb, the janitor, who said he saw Michelle walk toward her car but didn't see anyone approach her. They interviewed Sarah and the other newspaper staff members, who couldn't provide any useful information. They interviewed Richard and Dorothy repeatedly, until Dorothy started to feel like she was the one being accused of something. Weeks passed, then months. The leads dried up. The investigators moved on to other cases. The missing person posters that Dorothy had spent hours creating, the ones with Michelle's laughing photograph and the desperate plea for information, slowly faded in the store windows where they hung. The town that had rallied around the Newton family in those first frantic days began to pull back, to whisper, to move on with their lives. But Dorothy Newton couldn't move on. She wouldn't. Every morning she woke up and the first thought in her mind was Michelle. Every night she lay awake and stared at the ceiling and wondered where her daughter was sleeping, if she was sleeping at all, if she was even still alive. Richard handled his grief differently. He threw himself into work, spending longer and longer hours at the shop, coming home late with grease under his fingernails and an empty look in his eyes. He and Dorothy stopped talking about Michelle, not because they had forgotten her, but because every conversation led to the same unbearable place. The same questions without answers. The same guilt that ate at them both. The irrational belief that they should have done something, should have protected her, should have kept her safe somehow. A year after Michelle's disappearance, Dorothy made a decision that would alter the course of everything that came after. She walked into the police station with a cardboard box full of documents and demanded to speak to whoever was in charge. The officer who met with her was surprised to learn what she had been doing. For 12 months, while the official investigation had stalled, Dorothy Newton had been conducting her own. She had interviewed neighbors, collected rumors, tracked down former classmates who had moved away, and assembled a dossier of information that put the official case file to shame. She had found things, disturbing things, connections that the police had missed or ignored. She had discovered that 3 other girls from the surrounding area had gone missing in the past decade, all of them between the ages of 15 and 18, all of them described by their families as too smart for their own good. She had found records showing that one of those cases had been closed without investigation when the local sheriff declared the girl a runaway, despite her family's insistence that she would never have left voluntarily. And she had noticed something else, something that made her hands shake when she finally allowed herself to put the pieces together. All 4 disappearances had happened within a 30-mile radius. All 4 had happened during the first half of the year. And all 4 girls had one thing in common. They had all, at some point, come into contact with the same man. His name was Gregory Marsh. Gregory Marsh was, on the surface, exactly the kind of man that small towns adored. He was in his late 40s, distinguished-looking with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like a kindly professor. He ran a tutoring service out of his home, helping struggling students get their grades up and preparing promising ones for college entrance exams. Parents trusted him. Teachers recommended him. Church members praised his generosity and his dedication to the community's youth. Dorothy had discovered his connection to Michelle almost by accident. She was going through her daughter's belongings for the 100th time, searching for something, anything, that might provide a clue, when she found a business card tucked into the back of one of Michelle's textbooks. Marsh Academic Services, it read. Unlocking your full potential. Dorothy had never heard Michelle mention tutoring, had never seen any charges for it on their household accounts. But when she called the number on the card, Gregory Marsh himself answered. And the way he reacted when Dorothy said Michelle's name told her everything she needed to know. There was a pause, just a beat too long. And then Marsh's voice, smooth and sympathetic, explaining that yes, he had met Michelle once or twice, that she had inquired about his services but never signed up, that he was so terribly sorry about what had happened to her. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. It was delivered with perfect conviction. And Dorothy Newton, who had spent 17 years watching her daughter observe the lies that people told, recognized a liar when she heard one. She brought her evidence to the police. Deputy Morrison looked through her files with growing discomfort on his face. When she finished presenting her case, when she pointed out the connections between the missing girls and Gregory Marsh, when she demanded that they bring him in for questioning, Morrison sat back in his chair and sighed. He explained to Dorothy that Gregory Marsh was a respected member of the community. He explained that rumors and coincidences weren't evidence. He explained that accusing a man like that without proof would bring down the wrath of half the town on the department. And then he thanked Dorothy for her time and showed her to the door. Dorothy went home that night and sat in Michelle's room for 3 hours. She sat on her daughter's bed and looked at the posters on the walls, the books on the shelves, the photographs stuck to the mirror with tape. She talked to Michelle, out loud, the way she had done every night since her daughter had disappeared. She told her what she had learned and what she had tried to do and how she had failed. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, Dorothy Newton made a promise. She promised her daughter that she would never stop looking. She promised that she would find the truth, no matter how long it took, no matter what it cost her. She promised that whoever had taken Michelle would pay. What Dorothy didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that somewhere far away, Michelle was making a promise of her own. Here's the truth about March 14th, 1983, the truth that wouldn't come out for another 4 decades. Michelle Newton never got the chance to reach her car. She was walking across the parking lot, thinking about her government article, when a van pulled up beside her. A face she recognized leaned out the window. A voice she trusted asked if she needed a ride. And because Michelle was 17 and believed that bad things happened to other people, she climbed into that van. She didn't realize her mistake until the doors locked and the needle slid into her neck and the world went dark. She woke up in a basement. Concrete walls. No windows. A single bare light bulb swinging from the ceiling. Her hands were bound behind her back, and there was tape across her mouth, and Gregory Marsh was sitting in a folding chair across from her, watching her with an expression of patient interest, like a scientist observing an experiment. He talked to her that first night. He explained, in his calm professor's voice, exactly what was going to happen. He had done this before, he said. 3 times before. He had a system. The girls who cooperated lasted longer. The girls who didn't, well. He gestured vaguely at the concrete floor beneath them, and Michelle understood with horrifying clarity that she was not the first person to be held in this room. But Gregory Marsh had made a critical error. He had studied Michelle's school records. He had noted her intelligence, her curiosity, her dangerous habit of asking questions. He had read her journal and seen the threat she posed to his carefully constructed life. What he hadn't understood, what he could never have understood, was that those same qualities that made Michelle dangerous to him were also the qualities that would keep her alive. Michelle Newton wasn't just smart. She was adaptable. She was observant. And in those first terrible hours in that basement, while she screamed silently behind the tape on her mouth and felt the cold concrete against her back, she was already planning. Think about that for a moment. Think about being 17 years old, trapped in a basement by a monster, knowing that the people who loved you had no idea where you were or if you were even still alive. What would you do? What would any of us do? I want you to leave a comment below and tell me, honestly, do you think you could have survived what Michelle was about to go through? Do you think you could have found the strength to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless? Think about it. And then keep watching, because what Michelle Newton did next proved that human beings are capable of more than we could ever imagine. Michelle's survival strategy was built on a single, terrible realization. Gregory Marsh didn't want to kill her. Not yet. He wanted something else first, something that Michelle recognized from her readings about psychology and criminal behavior. He wanted to break her. He wanted to watch her spirit crumble. He wanted to own her completely before he disposed of her. And that desire, that sick compulsion to dominate before destroying, was the crack in his armor that Michelle would eventually exploit. She learned his patterns. He came to the basement twice a day, morning and evening, bringing food and water and his endless, terrifying monologues about power and control and the natural order of things. He had cameras installed in the corners of the room, watching her constantly, so she was careful to show him only what he wanted to see. She played the role of the broken victim, crying on cue, flinching at his approach, thanking him for the scraps of food he provided. But behind her eyes, behind the performance she gave him, Michelle Newton remained utterly, defiantly intact. She paid attention to everything. The way the light shifted slightly at certain times of day, suggesting there might be windows somewhere above her that she couldn't see. The sounds that filtered through the ceiling, car engines and bird songs, and once, distantly, a church bell ringing. The smell of salt in the air that told her she was no longer in Kentucky, that Marsh had transported her somewhere else entirely, somewhere near the ocean. Every detail she noticed, she stored away, building a mental map of her prison and her captor that grew more complete with each passing day. Weeks became months. The outside world faded into a distant memory, though Michelle clung to it desperately in her mind. She thought about her mother's face, her father's hands, the smell of coffee in their kitchen on Sunday mornings. She recited poetry to herself, passages from books she had loved, anything to keep her brain active and alive. She did exercises when Marsh wasn't watching, push-ups and stretches and running in place, keeping her body as strong as possible for the moment she knew would eventually come. She was waiting. She was preparing. And she was watching Gregory Marsh with the same dangerous observation that had first brought her to his attention. She learned his weaknesses. He was arrogant, so convinced of his own superiority that he underestimated everyone around him. He was lonely, desperate for someone to understand his twisted philosophy, often spending hours explaining himself to Michelle as if seeking validation. He was aging, moving more slowly than he used to, his reflexes dulled by time and complacency. And most importantly, he was comfortable. He had done this 3 times before and never been caught. He believed he was invincible. That belief would be his downfall. Michelle's first escape attempt came 4 months into her captivity. She had noticed that the lock on her ankle restraint was wearing down, the mechanism growing looser each time Marsh fastened and unfastened it. She spent weeks working on it, flexing her ankle back and forth, gradually expanding the gap until she could slip her foot free. She waited for a night when Marsh's footsteps overhead seemed heavier, slower, suggesting alcohol or fatigue. And then she ran. She made it to the top of the basement stairs before he caught her. He had been testing her, he said afterward, wanting to see how long it would take for her to try. He had cameras on the stairs she hadn't noticed. He had been watching the whole time. The punishment that followed was severe enough that Michelle understood her next attempt would need to be perfect. There would be no more room for error. A year passed, then 2. Michelle turned 18 in that basement, then 19, then 20. She marked the days by scratching tiny lines into the concrete behind her cot, lines that Marsh never noticed because he never looked that closely at anything but himself. She watched him age, watched his movements slow, watched the lock on her restraint grow looser and looser as he grew more careless. And she planned. During those years, she also learned something that changed everything. She wasn't the only one in the house. There were others, she realized gradually, other rooms with other prisoners, other girls who had been taken just as she had been. She could hear them sometimes, faint sounds through the walls, crying or screaming or praying in languages she didn't understand. Marsh was running something larger than she had imagined, something more organized and more horrifying. And Michelle knew that when she finally escaped, she couldn't leave those other girls behind. She started communicating with them. It took months to develop a system, a series of taps on the pipes that ran through the basement, a crude code that allowed them to exchange information. There were 3 others, she learned. A girl named Anna who had been there even longer than Michelle. A teenager called Lisa who still had hope in her voice when she tapped back. And someone who never responded at all, whose room had gone silent months ago, and whose fate Michelle tried not to think about. Together, they began to plan. The escape happened on a Thursday in March of 1987, almost exactly 4 years after Michelle had been taken. They had chosen the date carefully, waiting for Marsh to leave the property for one of his rare overnight trips. He had grown confident enough to leave them alone occasionally, trusting in his locks and cameras and the isolation of the Florida property where he had built his prison. He had been doing this for so long, had gotten away with it so completely, that he had forgotten the fundamental rule of predators and prey. The hunted are always watching, always waiting, always looking for the moment when the hunter lets his guard down. Michelle had spent those 4 years studying every aspect of her confinement. She knew the weak points in the walls, the blind spots in the camera coverage, the schedules of the guards Marsh sometimes hired to watch the property. She knew that the window in the upstairs bathroom had a lock that could be picked with a bobby pin, that the back fence had a loose board in the northwest corner, that there was a gas station 3 miles down the road where someone might have a phone. She knew everything she needed to know. And when she heard Marsh's car pull away that Thursday evening, she put her plan into motion. The restraint came off easily now, after years of patient work. Michelle moved silently up the basement stairs, listening at the door for any sound of movement. Nothing. She had the bobby pin she had stolen months ago from one of Marsh's jackets, and the lock gave way after 45 seconds of careful manipulation. She stepped into the main house for the first time since her capture, and for a moment, just a moment, she was overwhelmed by the sheer brightness of it, the windows and the furniture and the evidence of normal life that existed just feet above her prison. But there was no time for shock. Michelle found the other basement doors, 3 of them hidden behind ordinary-looking walls in the house's lower level. She freed Anna first, a woman in her 30s now who had been taken as a teenager, whose eyes had a hollow look that Michelle recognized from her own mirror. Then Lisa, who was barely 16 and couldn't stop crying as Michelle helped her up the stairs. The third room was empty. Its occupant, whoever she had been, was gone. Michelle didn't let herself think about what that meant. They made it to the back fence. They made it through the loose board. They made it to the road and started walking, for barefoot women in the Florida darkness, heading toward a gas station and a phone and the impossible dream of freedom. Michelle led the way, her mind racing through contingencies, watching for headlights, ready to dive into the underbrush at the first sign of danger. They were almost there, almost to safety, when they heard the car. Marsh had come back early. Michelle saw his headlights in the distance and knew with cold certainty that they would never outrun him. The other women froze, paralyzed by the terror of recapture. And in that moment, standing on a dark road in the middle of nowhere, Michelle Newton made a choice that would define the rest of her life. She told the others to run, hide in the swamp, get to the gas station, call the police. She would hold them off. They protested, but there was no time for arguments. Michelle pushed Anna toward the tree line and watched her disappear into the darkness with Lisa close behind. Then she turned to face the approaching headlights, and for the first time since her capture, she stopped pretending to be a victim. When Marsh got out of the car, he was laughing. He thought he had caught her, thought this was just another failed escape attempt, another opportunity to punish and break and control. He walked toward her with the casual confidence of a man who had never lost. But Michelle had spent 4 years watching this man, studying his movements, cataloging his weaknesses. She had been his prisoner. Now she would be his nightmare. The fight was brutal and brief. Marsh was older, slower, and completely unprepared for the ferocity of Michelle's attack. She fought with everything she had, every ounce of rage and pain and desperate survival instinct that had built up over 4 years of captivity. She fought for herself and for Anna and Lisa and for the girl whose room had gone silent. She fought for Dorothy and Richard, who had never stopped looking for her. She fought because she had made a promise in that basement, a promise that she would live, that she would escape, that she would make this man pay for everything he had done. When it was over, Gregory Marsh was unconscious on the ground, his arm broken, his face bloody. Michelle stood over him, breathing hard, and felt something shift inside her. She was no longer the curious girl who had asked too many questions. She was no longer the helpless prisoner counting days on a concrete wall. She was Michelle Newton, survivor, and she was finally, impossibly, free. The police arrived 23 minutes after Anna called from the gas station. They found Michelle sitting on the side of the road, guarding Marsh's unconscious body with a piece of pipe she had picked up from the ditch. She wouldn't move until they handcuffed him, until she saw him loaded into the back of a police car, until she was absolutely certain that he couldn't hurt anyone ever again. The investigation that followed was the largest in Florida history at the time. They found evidence in Marsh's house that connected him to 7 disappearances across 3 states over a 15-year period. They found journals detailing his crimes, photographs he had kept as trophies, and financial records showing that he had been selling access to his victims to other predators through an underground network. Michelle's testimony, delivered over 6 grueling days in court, was instrumental in securing convictions not just for Marsh, but for 11 other men who had participated in his operation. But the journey to that courtroom was anything but simple. In the immediate aftermath of the escape, Michelle was taken to a hospital where she spent 2 weeks being treated for malnutrition, infections, and injuries that had never healed properly during her captivity. She was interviewed by police, by FBI agents, by prosecutors building their case. She was asked to relive her trauma over and over again, each retelling peeling back the protective layers she had built around herself. And then, finally, she was reunited with her parents. The moment Dorothy Newton walked into that hospital room and saw her daughter alive, the daughter she had searched for and mourned for and never stopped believing in, she collapsed to her knees and wept. Richard stood in the doorway, unable to move, tears streaming down his face, looking at the young woman in the hospital bed as if she were a ghost made flesh. Michelle looked at them, at these people who had aged so much in 4 years, who had gray hair now where there had been none before, who carried the weight of every sleepless night and every unanswered prayer in the lines on their faces. And she said the only thing she could think to say, "I'm sorry I didn't come home for dinner." The recovery took years. Michelle had been changed by her experience in ways that couldn't be undone, had learned things about human cruelty and her own capacity for survival that would stay with her forever. There were nightmares, flashbacks, moments when she would freeze in the middle of ordinary activities, suddenly back in that basement, trapped in the terror of a past that wouldn't let her go. She went to therapy. She went to support groups. She learned to talk about what had happened to her, not because it was easy, but because silence gave her trauma power over her. But here's the part of the story that never made it into the news reports, the part that matters most. Michelle Newton didn't just survive. She transformed. The same qualities that had made her a target, her curiosity, her observation, her refusal to accept things at face value, became the foundation of a new life. She went back to school, earned her degree in journalism, and began investigating the very systems that had failed to find her for 4 years. She discovered that the case files for those other missing girls, the ones Dorothy had tried to tell the police about, had been deliberately buried. She found evidence of corruption in the local police department, officers who had been paid to look the other way, who had dismissed missing person reports without investigation, who had allowed Gregory Marsh to operate in plain sight because he knew the right people and had the right amount of money. And she published it all, every ugly truth, every name, every lie that had been told to protect a predator. The fallout was enormous. 3 police officers were charged with obstruction of justice. A local judge who had covered up evidence was removed from the bench. The state legislature passed new laws requiring independent oversight of missing person investigations, laws that became known informally as the Michelle Newton Act. The girl who had been erased had become impossible to ignore. Gregory Marsh was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Michelle was in the courtroom when the verdict was read, sitting between her parents, holding their hands. She watched as the man who had stolen 4 years of her life was led away in chains, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not joy, but something quieter, something like peace. The years that followed brought healing in ways Michelle hadn't thought possible. She stayed close to Anna and Lisa, the women she had escaped with, forming a bond that transcended ordinary friendship. They understood each other in ways that no one else could, shared a language of survival that needed no translation. Anna eventually became a social worker, dedicating her life to helping victims of trafficking. Lisa went to medical school, became a trauma surgeon, saved lives every day in an emergency room in Miami. They were all living proof that being a victim didn't mean staying a victim. Michelle published a book about her experience in 1995. It became a bestseller, not because people wanted to read about horror, but because they wanted to read about hope. They wanted to know that someone could walk through hell and come out the other side stronger. They wanted to believe that human beings could endure the unendurable and still find their way back to joy. Michelle gave them that belief, not through empty platitudes, but through the unflinching truth of her own survival. She met someone, a journalist named David, who had read her book and reached out to her through her publisher, initially just to ask for an interview. They met for coffee, then for dinner, then for long walks where they talked about everything and nothing, and slowly fell into the kind of love that neither of them had expected to find. David understood that Michelle would never be normal, that she carried scars that couldn't be seen and wounds that would never fully heal. He loved her anyway. He loved her because of those scars, not in spite of them, because they were proof of who she was, a survivor, a fighter, someone who refused to be erased. They got married in 2001, in a small ceremony on the beach in Florida, not far from the place where Michelle had once been held prisoner. Dorothy and Richard were there, older now, but still together, still holding hands the way they had since Michelle was a child. Anna was the maid of honor. Lisa flew in from Miami to give a toast. And as Michelle stood there in her white dress, watching the sun set over the water, she understood something that had taken her nearly 20 years to learn. The worst thing that ever happened to her had not destroyed her. It had revealed her. It had shown her who she really was, what she was capable of, how much strength she carried inside her that she never would have discovered any other way. It wasn't fair. It would never be fair. No one should have to survive what Michelle had survived just to discover their own power. But life wasn't fair. Life was brutal and random and full of monsters who preyed on the curious and the brave. And all any of us could do was keep going, keep fighting, keep refusing to let the darkness win. Michelle and David had 2 children, a girl named Hope and a boy named Richard, after Michelle's father. She raised them with the same fierce, protective love that Dorothy had given her, but also with something else, the knowledge that danger existed, that evil was real, and that the best defense against both was to be aware, to be prepared, and to never stop asking questions. She taught her children to pay attention, to trust their instincts, to speak up when something felt wrong. She taught them that survival wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about being the most adaptable, the most observant, the most unwilling to give up. Dorothy lived long enough to see both grandchildren born. She died in 2015, peacefully, in her sleep, with Richard by her side and Michelle holding her hand. Her last words to her daughter were simple: "I always knew you'd come home." Richard followed her 6 months later, his heart giving out on a quiet Sunday afternoon, as if he had simply been waiting for permission to join the love of his life. Michelle scattered their ashes together, in the backyard of the Kentucky house where she had grown up, where she had asked questions and read books and dreamed of a future that had turned out so differently than she had planned. Today, Michelle Newton is 60 years old. Her hair is gray now, like her mother's was at the end, and there are lines around her eyes that deepen when she laughs. She still laughs often, that same sudden, genuine, infectious laugh that people remember from her childhood photographs. She lives in a house by the ocean, the same ocean she had once glimpsed through cracks in a basement prison. But now she wakes up every morning to the sound of waves and knows that she is free. She still works, though not as much as she used to. She speaks at conferences for law enforcement, training detectives to recognize the signs of human trafficking, to follow up on missing person cases with the urgency they deserve, to never make the assumptions that allowed Gregory Marsh to operate for 15 years. She mentors young journalists, teaching them to ask the dangerous questions, to follow the threads that others ignore, to shine light into dark corners no matter what the cost. And she writes, still, always, filling journals just as she did when she was a girl, though now her words have the weight of experience behind them. The story of Michelle Newton has been told many times, in books and documentaries and made-for-television movies that never quite got it right. But the truest version of the story isn't about the kidnapping or the basement or the escape. The truest version is about what came after. It's about a woman who refused to let the worst thing that ever happened to her become the only thing that defined her. It's about parents who never stopped searching, who kept their daughter's hope alive even when the world told them to move on. It's about survivors who found each other in the darkness and held on until they reached the light. And it's about this. Somewhere in the world right now, someone is going through the worst moment of their life. Someone is trapped in their own basement, literal or metaphorical, wondering if they will ever escape. Someone is being told to give up, to accept, to let go of the hope that keeps them going. And to that person, wherever they are, Michelle Newton's story says one thing: don't stop fighting. Don't stop believing. Don't let them win. Because here's what 4 decades and one impossible escape taught Michelle Newton. Human beings are stronger than we know. We can endure things that should destroy us and find a way back to joy. We can take the worst of what life throws at us and transform it into something meaningful, something that helps others, something that matters. The darkness is real. The monsters are real. But so is the light. So is the strength inside every person who refuses to be erased. Michelle still visits the beach where she got married, walking along the shore at sunset, watching the waves roll in and out. Sometimes David walks with her. Sometimes she goes alone. And sometimes, when the light is just right, she could swear she feels her parents beside her, Dorothy and Richard, watching over her the way they always did, proud of the woman she became, grateful beyond words that their daughter finally came home. The last photograph ever taken of Michelle Newton shows her laughing. Her head is thrown back, gray hair catching the late afternoon Florida sun, and there's a joy in her 60-year-old face that makes your chest ache when you know what came before. That photograph was taken last week, exactly 41 years after the worst day of her life. And in it, she looks exactly like what she is: a survivor, a fighter, a woman who walked through hell and came out the other side with her spirit intact. She is proof that the story doesn't end when the nightmare begins. She is proof that redemption is possible, that healing is real, that light can follow even the darkest darkness. And every day she wakes up, every breath she takes, every laugh she shares with her children and grandchildren and the survivors who became her sisters, is a victory over the man who tried to erase her. Gregory Marsh died in prison in 2019, alone and forgotten. No one came to his funeral. No one spoke his name with love or grief. He was buried in an unmarked grave, and the world moved on without him, as if he had never existed at all. But Michelle Newton? Michelle Newton lives on, in the laws that bear her name, in the survivors she has helped, in the journalists she has trained, in the children who carry her strength into the next generation, in the story you have just heard, which you will carry with you, which might someday help someone else who needs to know that survival is possible. That is Michelle Newton's revenge. Not violence, not hatred, not the destruction of her enemy. Her revenge is a life well lived. Her revenge is every sunrise she witnesses, every grandchild she holds, every moment of joy she claims in defiance of the man who tried to take everything from her. She won.